Now we'll move on to the final session of the day. We'll give the floor over to Keir Giles from the Conflict Studies Research Centre in the UK for the Fireside Chat with Chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, Dmitri Alperovitch. The topic of that chat will be the need for a new cyber strategy. And as always, you are more than welcome to post questions using the chat function and also to share your thoughts in social media. But without further ado, gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lena, and thank you, Henrik. And it's a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I'm so glad we can make it. We've got very used over the last year and a bit to hearing people saying, what a great conference, but aren't we so much looking forward to actually being in person in the right place? But the difference, of course, with CyCon is when people say that, you know that they actually mean it. It will be tremendous when we can finally get together again in Tallinn. But for now, there's no fireside, but we will have Dmitri Alperovitch, and I'm greatly looking forward to talking over some of the broader cyber issues that we've been coming up against over the last few months and pulling out some of the threads from the other conversations that we've been hearing during CyCon. Now, Dmitri, when we spoke the other day, you were talking about how you had slightly stepped to the side from cyber issues with your new baby, the Silverado Policy Accelerator, which is looking at broader topics, at great power competition, at China, trade, industrial policy, the environment, and so on. We'll probably get a chance to talk a little bit about that later on. But for now, the exam question, as you just heard, is the need for a new cyber strategy. In fact, it wasn't even put as a question. There's no question mark on the end. It's stated there is a need for a new cyber security strategy. I want to ask you, because a lot of people have got quite exercised lately with a busy time for cyber things and stuff with Solarwinds and exchange issues, and a lot of people who don't normally engage with cyber issues coming up with strong opinions about how we need a new approach, this is a game changer, and everything is broken, probably because of the scale and depth of those problems and the false sense of security that people had been lulled into previously. But let's start precisely with that issue, the statement that we have been posed, the need for the new cyber strategy. It's gripped people's imagination, this idea. How do you feel about it?
Thanks, Keir, for having me, and great to be, at least virtually, at CyCon. Hope to be soon back in Tallinn in person. What an amazing city. Always love going there. Well, let me start with saying that the cyber strategy needs to be rooted in geopolitical strategy. I coined a phrase over half a decade ago that we don't have a cyber problem. We have a China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea problem. And that's really more true than ever. And it's not to say that most of the attacks that we're seeing are nation-state sponsored attacks from those countries. We certainly see a lot of criminal activity, such as the Colonial pipeline hack that we witnessed just a few weeks ago. However, even the majority of the cybercrime that we're seeing is emanating from those four countries, from criminal groups or sometimes state actors that are allowed to moonlight in this domain, or sometimes even sponsored and harbored by those nation states. So while not all, the vast majority of the problem is because you have these safe havens where cybercrime has been allowed to prosper and spread over the course of the last couple of decades, particularly in Russia. And but now we're seeing the same happening in China and Iran and other places. And that's the root problem that we need to start thinking about. How do we address? How do we confront these nation states that pose such a deep threat to us on the economic espionage front, on the destructive attack front, and on the supporting of the cybercrime as well. So that's step number one. Step number two is start thinking about a different defensive approach. You know, we're coming up on almost 4 decades of trying to do the same thing, of building up better defenses to cyber attacks, and things are only keep getting worse, right? One of the first attacks that we had seen was back in the 80s, the famous Cuckoo's Egg book that was written by Cliff Stoll, highlighting the intrusion of people hired by the then East German Stasi into American academic networks in order to infiltrate the military networks. And it's just continued on since then. And the reality is that we need to come to terms with the fact that a capable adversary, particularly an adversary that's sponsored by a foreign intelligence service, that can use both SIGINT methods as well as human efforts to infiltrate networks will always be able to get in. That does not mean that they will succeed in their objectives, but the idea that we can keep them out, the idea that we can train all our people to recognize phishing attacks, the idea that we will never have zero-day exploits, the idea that everyone will patch their systems on time, is just not realistic. And we have 4 decades, almost 4 decades of proof that it does not work, will not work, and we need a different approach. And the approach really needs to be focused on how do we, assuming that someone is going to get in, stop them from accomplishing their objective. Playing to our strengths, which is understanding our networks and being able to recognize an intrusion once they're there, and preventing them from moving laterally, preventing them from exfiltrating data, preventing them from encrypting data. Some of the concepts like zero trust that we've just now started to apply in network design are key to all of this, but also operate under the assumption of assumed breach.
Dmitri, thanks. I'm so glad that you leapt straight in there with that motto, I think, of yours about how it is not a cyber problem, but it's a country problem. And yes, taking for granted that we have a tactical issue with cyber and a strategic problem with how to deal with all of the people that wish to do us harm. But still, there is that common denominator of all of the issues that we're talking about, that it is a cyber problem, and the vector through which all of these problems are delivered are, in fact, cyber. And that's the issue that I'd like to drag you back to. And you've spoken a little bit about how the current approach isn't working. And I wonder to what extent it doesn't need a more deep and broad reimagining of exactly how we can solve these problems. Because we have the systemic issues, but we also have this succession of self-inflicted injuries that make the problem worse. None of the things that you have just been describing would actually necessarily have succeeded without some own goals by the victim side. We heard President Cluley yesterday saying in her very polite, bemused way that it was stunning that Solarwinds didn't have a chief information security officer or a security director on their payroll, despite selling security solutions to the US government, and was still using crude passwords. And just personally, this morning, I was having a long argument with one of my financial service providers who decided to sign me up for a new app and send me the username and password in a plain text email. And it was very hard to convince them that there might be anybody out there who would prefer them not to do that. So we have a human problem as well, including from the people who we actually trust to provide these solutions and make them work. And it's all to do with the fundamental insecurity of so many of the solutions we're being provided with. How do we tackle that in the context of this new approach that you're talking about? How do we deal with that root problem?
You can't. The question you're posing is how do we fix people? And you can't, of course. And without commenting on the specifics of, I'm not going to defend whether the fact that Solarwinds didn't have a CISO. But when you look at the sophistication of that attack, I guarantee you 99% of the software providers of critical software to U.S. government like Solarwinds would fall prey to that. Whether they have a CISO or not, whether they use password 123 or not, the reality is the attack was conducted in such a sophisticated way, in memory only, modifying source code on the fly to inject a backdoor in real time. Very, very few organizations out there would have been able to detect it and stop it in time. So you're going to continue to have these supply chain attacks. And the reality is that it's not the first time we've seen one. There's a great article in Wired just about a week ago talking about the RSA attack that we're coming up on the 10th year anniversary of. That was one of the first supply chain hacks we had seen, where they had broken into RSA to steal their seed values that they can use then to compromise two-factor authentication and get into companies like Lockheed. We have seen lots and lots of those attacks. NotPetya was another example of it. So the idea that you're going to stop them all by better training or hiring more CISOs or what have you is just ludicrous. It will never happen. And you need to assume that your vendors will get compromised. And sometimes their updates will have backdoors that you will deploy in your network. What you need to do is assume that they will get there. And how do you operate under that assumption will actually succeed at stopping the adversary from achieving their objective?
Right. So scoping the problems into those we can fix and those we can't, which covers a broad sector of the problem. Thanks for injecting that note of optimism. Let me come back to the two big issues that we've touched on, the SolarWinds and the Exchange. It struck me as surprising slightly that one of those got far, far more engagement and capturing people's imagination, Solarwinds, than Exchange, which seemed to, by contrast, pass by rather quietly. What do you think lies behind this very different approach to the two issues and the very different reaction that they've engendered, not just from professionals, it seems, but also from politicians and the public?
That's a great question, Keir, and it's something I've been puzzled over over the last few months. In fact, I wrote an article for Lawfare specifically contrasting the Solarwinds operation versus the Exchange hacks by China. And it strikes me that to the extent that we want Russia to do any hacking whatsoever, Solarwinds is a precisely example of the type of operation we would want them to continue conducting versus all the other ones that we had seen from them. It was very targeted, very precise, limited collateral damage, even though through the SolarWinds backdoor, they managed to infect tens of thousands of victims. They actually voluntarily shut down their access, permanently shut down their access to 99% of the victims, only focusing on the targets that they cared about, government networks and other IT and security firms that they could use for follow-on supply chain hacks. So very precise and very carefully executed operation focused on espionage. No data was destroyed. No data was manipulated as far as we know. We're not going to stop nation states like Russia and others conducting espionage because we do it against them as well. It's sort of a norm that everyone accepts, both in cyber and in traditional physical world. So that's the type of operation that, to the extent, again, you want the Russians to do anything, that would be the one that you would want for them to continue doing versus the NotPetya, versus the election interference, versus the other ransomware attacks that are coming out of cybercrime groups operating in Russia. And it strikes me that hammering Russia for the SolarWinds operation is counterproductive because you're just telling them that we will not accept anything that you do in cyber, even when it's targeted espionage operations, and we're going to institute sanctions against you and the like. And that I think sends a wrong message. Now, contrast that with the Exchange hack, which was not precise, which was not targeted, which the Chinese literally scanned the entire world looking for vulnerable Exchange servers, hacked virtually all of them, and not only hacked them, but actually opened them up via web shells for other groups to come in and execute ransomware operations and the like against those victims. So completely reckless and disruptive. And yet we still have not done as U.S. government anything in response to that attack. So I hope that the U.S. government will take a strong position on the Hafnium Exchange operation, and that we institute sanctions and other measures against China for that to at a minimum keep some balance here. But from the media perspective, I think the fact that it was Russia doing SolarWinds, I'm sure had a lot to do with the public's attention being so captured by that hack.
Well, that's an interesting side topic, isn't it? And it's been commented that in a way the two actors have flipped approaches between the bull in a china shop or not caring who you alert and the very precise, tailored, covert approach. Russia and China have switched sides. And there's, of course, been some informed commentary that a lot of that is down to who precisely on the Russian state side is actually carrying out the attack and the different operating styles that they have. That's a point I'd like to bring you back to in a few minutes, if I may. But in the meantime, we've had a question come in from the audience, which is on a similar topic that you were just raising, the assume breach strategy. And my apologies to the audience, I can't actually see on our system who posed the question, so this is anonymous. But our audience member asks, Dmitri, how would an assume breach strategy work for the people and organizations that haven't been able to patch their systems in 4 decades? Isn't the current level of maturity too low for that? Our audience member asks, how would you fix that user problem for this new strategy you're talking about?
Well, that strategy is exactly designed for that problem. You're not going to patch your way out of this problem. Like the reality is that most organizations are not able to patch timely for a wide variety of reasons. Part of it is resources. Part of it is being unable to take systems out of production at key moments in time. Many companies, for example, in the retail sector and transportation sector, shut down all patching operations except the most critical ones from basically October 1st till the end of the year because of the shipping and other loads that they're experiencing related to the holiday season. in the US and in Europe. So for a variety of business operations, they cannot patch. And by the way, even if you patch everything, you'll still have the zero-day issue where many capable actors are able to find vulnerabilities that you would never be able to patch because no patch exists. So the idea here is don't waste your time trying to patch and thinking that that's going to solve everything. Yes, of course, patching is a good thing and try to do it, but much better from a resource allocation perspective to spend most of your effort assuming that someone's going to get in. They're going to get in because you didn't patch. They're going to get in because they found a zero-day that you weren't even aware of. They're going to get in because there's a backdoor in one of your software tools like Solarwinds. They're going to get in because it's an insider. There's a million ways that they can get in. They will get in. Assume that they're there and try to find them and stop them before they accomplish their objective. That's where we need to spend the vast majority of our efforts. And by the way, it's analogous to what we do in counterintelligence, right? We do not assume in intelligence communities in the US or Europe that, or frankly, in our adversary countries as well, that a capable nation state will not be able to recruit a source inside of the intelligence community. In fact, if you look at the history just in the US alone, we have to assume at any given moment in time, we have foreign spies working for our intelligence community. We have literally a 100-year history of finding them in every decade since that. And what we do is we try to identify them not by stopping them from coming in. Obviously, we do some efforts, polygraphs, background checks, and like. We assume that those will fail. And we continuously try to look for suspicious activities, check people's finances for any unusual bank receipts and the like, to find them once they're in. We need to take the same approach in cyber and spend most of our efforts finding them, assuming that they're already there.
Well, this all makes sense. Let me zoom out just a tiny bit. I think the question may have been taking patching really as an example of cultural shifts that are incredibly difficult to bring into the broader user environment. And I think it might be more about that cultural problem overall. Yes, assume breach of the specialists perhaps can cope with that. How will the public, the users, the politicians in particular, adjust to that new mentality? I mentioned a moment ago that part of this resonance that the SolarWinds hack has sparked among society seems to be because there was this assumption of security beforehand, that this sort of thing ought not to be possible. How do we go about, first of all, challenging that and then bringing this new attitude in that is the essential bedrock for that new kind of approach to security that you're talking about? Where would you start?
It's such a great question because I honestly don't know what it would take in terms of how many headlines like SolarWinds, like NotPetya, like the ransomware hacks that we're seeing on a daily basis for people to stop assuming that their systems are secure. Another phrase I coined over a decade ago was that there are only two types of companies, those that know that they've been hacked and those that don't yet know, but they've all been hacked. And at the time, I got a lot of criticism for that. What are you talking about? Obviously, 10 years later, it's become much more apparent that indeed it's very hard to find an organization out there that has not been penetrated and penetrated often multiple times. But the reality is that those systems are not secure. They will never be secure. I believe it was Robert Morris, the senior, that coined a joke back in the 80s that there are only three things you have to do to secure your computer. One is don't plug it into the network. 2, don't turn it on. 3, don't buy a computer, and you'll be perfectly secure. I mean, there's some truth to that in that you will not have perfect security. People will continue to find vulnerabilities, sometimes in the humans that operate those systems, sometimes in the systems themselves. They'll exploit them. They will get in, and you need to shift resources. And this is fundamentally an allocation of resources issue. Most of your resources need to be spent on trying to find people that are already inside and kicking them out as rapidly as possible, focusing on speed in order to win, not on building walls trying to prevent them from coming in. Some effort on prevention is important, but it cannot be 99% of the allocation that it is today.
Well, it seems that answer to that question of after 4 decades, how many headlines does it take to change attitudes? That seems to answer itself, because it looks like the answer is not in the headlines, since they don't have that effect. And as well as companies either knowing they've been hacked or not knowing yet that they've been hacked, it seems the same with people. There is no substitute at the moment for learning the hard way, which again is not a particularly optimistic conclusion, but something we need to grapple with. Let me bring you back to that issue of the different threat actors and the different ways in which we need to assume threats are going to be coming from different directions. Now, you talked about a baseline strategy, which is a kind of one-size-fits-all for dealing with the threat overall. But what about considering those differences in both methods and objectives for the 4 actors that you named: China, Iran, North Korea, Russia? What is it specifically? And of course, breaking down within those the different attitudes, for example, from the GRU, the SVR, the FSB within Russia and their counterparts elsewhere. Where do you think the most interesting and difficult cyber threats come from if you look across that landscape of the people who wish to do us harm?
You know, I have a very contrarian view on this, Keir, and that is that North Korea, I believe, is the most creative actor out of any of them. They've really pioneered a lot of the attacks that we're now seeing being adopted by other threat actors. They were the first ones to do destructive attacks from a nation-state perspective back in the mid-2000s, as they were starting to do operations against South Korea and using wiper malware that was then adopted by the Iranians and the Russians. They were the first ones to do a dump and leak operation. We often think that the Russians were the first ones to do it in the 2016 elections, but the Sony hack was actually the original example of stealing emails and then leaking it to WikiLeaks for publication, which was very effective at destroying reputations of a number of executives within Sony that I'm sure did not go unnoticed in Moscow when they were conducting their election interference operations about a year and a half later. They were the first ones to really engage in cybercrime on a massive scale. Breaking into banks, breaking into cryptocurrency exchanges, stealing lots of money to finance the regime. So a lot of the things that we're now seeing from other nation states, the North Koreans pioneered, and their technical sophistication is very good. They've been honing their skills on South Korea for almost 2 decades now, using sort of a free fire test range, and over time expanding to other targets across the globe. So they're a force to be reckoned with for sure.
And yes, somehow they've done all of this while at the same time remaining under most people's radar. You talk to people about where the cyber threats come from, and they might mention China, Russia, and if they think about it a bit, Iran, and then way down the field comes North Korea. So I think that's a bonus points for Pyongyang as well, for actually making sure that nobody has them at the front of their mind while doing all of this. But in the RSE keynote not so long ago, you mentioned that the biggest threat is not actually the nation states, but ransomware. And I wondered if you could pull that apart. So is that really a separate problem from the nation states that might want to condone, to encourage, to allow ransomware attacks to be launched from their territory? Can we actually really split it out like that? Or is it again, coming down to the approaches that we need to take across the board in order to protect ourselves on a systemic level?
Yeah, great question. And by the way, I made that statement that ransomware is a top threat before the colonial hack. So I'll take some credit for highlighting it before it was even top of mind for many people outside of the cyber industry. But I think when you look at where most of the ransomware is coming from, not all of it, but most of it, it's coming from Russia. It's coming from criminals operating within the Russian Federation. Many of them known to the Russian government. Many of them harbored by the Russian government. Some of them over the years have been identified by U.S. law enforcement. They have provided evidence to Russian law enforcement, and nothing has been done. No arrests, no investigations, no prosecutions. So the only thing that you can extrapolate from that is the Russian government is, at a minimum, completely uninterested in prosecuting cybercrime within its borders when evidence is brought to it, and at a maximum is actively supporting and encouraging those types of activities. So yes, while there's no evidence that the Russian government itself is involved in ransomware operations, the fact that they're allowing these groups to operate within their borders even when they know about them and have been provided evidence, highlights how big of a problem Russia itself is as a purveyor of ransomware.
That is absolutely right. And it's a point that we've been trying to get across for a decade or more, that all of the conversations about whether the Russian state is actually complicit in attacks coming from its territory, whether there is a direct line on the org chart from the Kremlin to the cyber criminal, really misses the point that if Russia did not want this stuff to happen, they would find it really straightforward to stop it. And therefore, we should be having the conversation from a completely different angle. Now, we're not seeing many questions coming in from the audience at the moment. I think they're probably too busy studying your book shelf and your coin rack to see where you've been and who you're reading. Please do, audience members, send in some more questions while we have still 5 minutes left to put them to Dmitri. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for anybody to come up with anything exciting and challenging, let's take a step sideways again from cyber. Now, the issue you're working on at the moment is related but separate, and it's another big challenge that you and Silverado see at the moment, and it is the semiconductor crisis. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that, and specifically how you see that affecting our current area of interest. What does it actually mean with the short and long term, and how are we going to deal with it?
Well, I'll make a statement that's a little bit strange for a cyber person, the one I spent 25 years working in this field, to say, but I believe the top national security problem in technology today is not cyber, it is semiconductors. And we often say in the semiconductor world that semiconductor is the new oil. And that's actually the wrong way to think about it, because at least there are replacements for oil. There's renewable energy, there's gas, there's all kinds of other things that you can use to produce energy. There is no replacement for semiconductors. And we're seeing that now with the shortage that we're experiencing at the moment. It's impacting car sales. It's impacting home sales, because in a bunch of places in the US right now, new construction cannot be finished because they're missing microwaves, they're missing washers and dryers that you have to, by code, put in before you can finalize construction. And they can't procure those items because of a semiconductor shortage. They're literally in everything that we use today, from your coffee maker to your computer to your iPhone. And there is a shortage today that's mostly COVID related and a huge spike in demand. But the biggest strategic threat over the long term is that the vast majority of semiconductors, both the leading edge semiconductors, the 5-7 nanometers that you use in your iPhones and your cloud computing and your AI applications, as well as the so-called trailing edge semiconductors, the older technology nodes, like the 65 nanometer, the 28 nanometers. They're used in cars, they're used in TVs, they're used in lots and lots of other things. They're mostly coming from one company, TSMC, that is located in Taiwan. Taiwan happens to be 100 miles across the Taiwanese Straits from China. If something happens to Taiwan, an invasion, a blockade, or even a weather event like a typhoon or a drought. Semiconductor manufacturing uses a lot of oil, and there's actually drought in Taiwan right now that is having some impact on production capacity for TSMC. That will have global implications, and a lasting shortage of semiconductors will have devastating impact on global economy. So this is one of the key issues that we're working on at Silverado, in addition to cyber, in addition to some other things, that we need to diversify our supply chain on semiconductors. We need to bring more of it to the US, but we also need to work with allies. We need to bring more of it to Europe, to South Korea, to Japan, to other partners, so that there is not one choke point in Taiwan for this super critical technology. And frankly, the best way to solve cyber is to not have semiconductors, because nothing will work. And we'll all be perfectly secure, but we'll also be living back in the Stone Ages.
So a potentially huge problem, with one which is even more remote from public consciousness than all of the cyber issues we were talking about before. We are close to time, but we have had another audience question come in, and it is a classic. It is one that we have heard chewed over at great length at successive CyCons ever since they started running in 2009. And it's the attribution one, but a specific take on attribution. And I suspect you may have a brief potted answer to this that you can fit into the remaining 90 seconds or so that we have. I'll read the question to you. It's: what sort of standards of proof should be required for official attribution and sanctions? Is there a problem that media and other private interests may attribute on shaky grounds that influence the public opinion? I suspect you have some well-developed thoughts on that. So let's round off the session with that. Thanks, Dmitri.
That's a great question. So look, I think there have to be multiple standards for attribution. If you're going to go into a court of law and prosecute someone for a cyber attack, obviously you need a very high degree of proof beyond a reasonable doubt to convict them, at least in the U.S. Court. When it comes to public opinion, the level of proof is much lower, and it has always been that way. Cyber is not special. Look at the allegations about Russian poisonings in Salisbury, or the GRU operations all over Europe, or the poisoning of Navalny, or the allegations about the use of chemical weapons in Syria, a wide variety of things that we accuse foreign states of doing and sanction them for those efforts. We don't reveal all the evidence, as in the US government, for how we arrive at that. Some of it is based, I'm sure, on very sensitive intelligence. Some of it is not. But we leave it up to the courts to actually dig into the details of that. But the standard that the nation states have used for taking action against other nation states have always been low in the international relations realm, and will continue to do so. And cyber is no special.
Great. Dmitri, we could carry on talking about all of those issues for hours, but we are unfortunately at time, so we'll have to park it there and hand back to Henrik and Lena. It's been great chatting, and I'll hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
So, thank you, gentlemen, for allowing us to follow your truly interesting discussion. It would appear that we are indeed in need of improving our cyber strategies, which is, of course, something that we should constantly strive to improve. And acting as if your opponents are already in your systems, or in our systems, may indeed be an approach worth pursuing.
But this rounds up today's topics. So, thank you to all the participants for your active participation, and of course to all the speakers and moderators for their contribution. We look forward to seeing you again tomorrow at 1500 Eastern European Summer Time. So have a wonderful rest of the day.